Welcome to today's episode called Tulip Mania, the world's first financial bubble with a question mark. I love business stories from any time, as long as it's full of drama or success or failure or interesting characters. I don't care if it's 1 year old or 1,000 years old. And the tulip bubble from the 1600s has drama in spades. I've always wanted to dig into it because Tulip Mania, it's always remembered as the first market bubble. I mean, picture the scene, January 1637, in taverns across Holland, where fortunes are made and lost on a flower that bloomed for just 1 week of the year. And men traded houses, farms for a single bulb. And the story, it's been told for centuries as the world's first great financial bubble. The madness of crowds overtaken by financial speculation. So a tale of greed, folly, overnight collapse. But there's a twist in this tale. And who doesn't love a good old twist? It's a cracking story. Enjoy. Originally, tulips, they weren't a manicured garden thing. They grew wild out in the valleys of the Teen Shan Mountains. That's at the border where China and Tibet meet Afghanistan and Russia. But by 1055, they were being cultivated in Istanbul, Turkey. And in that city, the nobles and the sultans, to them, the tulip, it was this divine flower, a symbol of wealth and beauty, but also humility. Because remember, the flower, as it stands tall, it also has its head bowed. So fast forward to 1559, where a councilman in Augsburg, Germany, recorded the very first tulip blooming on European soil. And it's this bright, exotic, totally alien flower when compared to anything that's grown locally. So the European elite, they were enthralled by it, and in the courts of princes, among scholars and collectors, the tulip, it became this object of desire. And the man who was responsible for bringing the tulip to the Netherlands is a guy called Carolus Clusius. So he's a botanist who managed to get his hands on tulip bulbs in Vienna and brought them back to Holland. And he classified them, took notes, and that's when he spotted something extraordinary. Every so often, a tulip would, what he called, break. So in other words, a solid red might suddenly return with golden flames streaked across it. A purple flower might split into intricate stripes and flecks. Now, he didn't know it back then, but that was actually a virus that was afflicting these particular flowers. But to him, they looked like little miracles that gave some batches of tulips this extraordinary bloom. Now, Clusius, he wasn't a very generous guy. He guarded those bulbs jealously. If he parted with any, he wanted steep prices. And that exclusivity, it only made them more desirable. Everyone wanted in. Local growers, merchants, anyone who had caught wind of this strange bloom that could fetch good money. They all were interested. So what happened? Well, people started stealing them. They crept into his garden at night, pinched bulbs and sold them, or else grew them themselves. And those stolen bulbs multiplied. They spread into private gardens, and those new growers, unlike Clusius, they shared, they traded, they experimented. And the timing was perfect, because you have to picture Dutch society at the turn of the 17th century. So the 80 Years' War with Spain is still dragging on. That started in the 1560s, and it's running right through this whole story. But while that's happening, Dutch port cities like Amsterdam, Haarlem, Delft, they're buzzing. Merchants are flooding in. They're building trading operations, including what becomes the Dutch East India Company. And I'm definitely going to do a full episode on that company at some stage. But a quick summary, because it is a fascinating story. The Dutch East India Company was founded in 1602. And by most estimates, it is still the most valuable company in history. We're talking a market cap north of $5 trillion in today's money. And at its peak, it had about 50,000 employees, including 10,000 soldiers, hundreds of ships, and it was paying dividends of 40% per annum. But of course, it was ruthless. It was using violence to monopolise spices, enslaving populations. I mean, people might give out about the sharp practices and influence of multinationals these days, and rightly so, but geez, they're altar boys compared to the Dutch East India Company. So, the Dutch were getting rich. They're becoming the most sophisticated financial market in Europe, with Amsterdam was this beating heart of global finance because it had the continent's lowest interest rates and it had a thriving stock exchange. And unlike much of Europe, which was still ruled by landowners, aristocrats, in the Netherlands, the wealth was in the hands of these newly minted merchants, urban oligarchs, I suppose is what they were. And into that climate, tulips fit perfectly because, of course, they're more than flowers, they're trophies, status symbols. As one author put it, as luxury objects, tulips fit well into a culture of both abundant capital and new cosmopolitanism. And rare bulbs started getting extravagant names. You have like the Admiral van der Eyck, General van Haarlem. So they were naval, military, heroic names, giving these flowers, I suppose, a sense of glory. By the 1610s, demand, it was skyrocketing, but the supply was painfully slow because tulips grow at their own pace. Each bulb produces only a handful of daughters a year. Now, a daughter is a small offshoot bulb that sprouts from the parent, and each bulb will produce a handful of these. And the broken tulips, those streaked with those amazing colours, they are often the weakest growers because the very virus that gave them their beauty also made them fragile, and that scarcity only sent their value up higher and higher. And already by the 1620s, one tulip had achieved legendary status. This was the Semper Augustus. Its petals were white, streaked with blood-red flames, as if painted by hand, and it was so rare that some accounts claim that only a dozen bulbs existed in all of Europe, maybe even fewer. And that scarcity turned the Semper Augustus into the crown jewel of tulip collecting. In 1623, someone put 1,000 guilders on the table for a single bulb. To give some perspective to that, a skilled craftsman might earn 200 guilders in a whole year. But as we shall see, the prices went up even higher, apparently. 2 years later, in 1625, another bulb supposedly changed hands for 3,000 guilders. Now, it's hard to quantify exactly how much this would have been in today's money, but the research indicates that at its height, the very best bulbs could have been selling for around $1 million, with many bulbs selling in the range of 50,000 to 150,000. So all that money for a flower that blooms for just 1 week. Now, throughout this time, the trading of tulips was between two groups. The bloemisten, which were gentlemen collectors who treated the tulips like living works of art, and then professional growers. Now, sometimes they were one and the same. Oftentimes, though, they clashed, competing for the rarest bulbs, bidding the prices up and up. And by 1633, the stories, they get outrageous. One man apparently traded his entire house for 3 bulbs. Another man swapped a well-kept farm for a handful of tulips. News of these deals, they spread like wildfire through taverns and marketplaces, and suddenly ordinary folk, barbers, brewers, cobblers, they all wanted in. Most had never touched a tulip before, but now they were pooling their savings together, pawning belongings, and hoping to, flip bulbs and make a fortune. And out of nowhere, tulip trading clubs called colleges started meeting in taverns across Amsterdam, Haarlem, Delft, and all the main towns and cities. Over beer and wine, contracts were scribbled down, hands were shaken, deals were done late into the night. And the thing is, the bulbs didn't even have to leave the ground. Paper was enough, a note promising a future delivery of a flower. It had become, I suppose you could say, a forerunner to the futures market. And this is important because the roots are the precursor to futures trading. They are in the 17th century Holland at this time because Amsterdam merchants were used to risky sea voyages and volatile prices, and so they invented contracts to lock in costs ahead of time. And this would have started with grain. It moved into shares like the Dutch East India Company, and then into luxury goods. So by the time tulips had come to the fore, the Dutch were familiar with and trusted this idea, this early concept of futures. But of course it was risky. These were flowers that had yet to bloom. There was no way of knowing exactly what you were speculating on. And back then they likened it to purchasing a cat in a bag. You never knew what you'd get. And they even had a nickname for this type of trading. It was called wind handle or wind trade. And deals backed by nothing but air. But nobody cared about the actual tulip anymore. What mattered was the gamble and the belief that tomorrow's price would be higher than today's. And of course, the prices kept rising. By 1635, one deal reportedly involved 40 bulbs for 100,000 guilders, around 10 million euro in today's money. In Haarlem and Amsterdam, young men who bought a single bulb suddenly styled themselves as florists. Established merchants already rich from shipping and trade, they saw tulips as an easy way to multiply their fortunes. And everywhere there was a fear of being left out. Nobody wanted to miss out on the frenzy. And isn't that what bubbles are all about? Now, Charles Mackay, or Mackay, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. He's a Scottish journalist who wrote a book in 1841 called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. So this was after the bubble had burst. And a lot of the stories around tulip mania come from this book. And this is how he describes how it took hold of the country. The rage among the Dutch to possess them was so great that the ordinary industry of the country was neglected, and the population, even to its lowest dregs, embarked in the tulip trade. And anyone could get involved because, and this is crucial, you didn't need to put any money up front. Sometimes maybe a small deposit, but more often than not, the deal was done with a handshake or a signature, no collateral. You could agree to buy a bulb worth 1,000 guilders without any money changing hand. All you need to do was to promise to pay when it bloomed months later. And a lot of buyers just flipped the contract onto someone else, pocketing the difference. But of course, not everyone bought into it. Moralists, they railed against the madness, calling it vanity and sin. Calvinists and Calvinism was a very, very powerful force in the Netherlands at this time. They sneered and sermonized at what they saw as, I suppose, gambling dressed up as horticulture. Pamphlets circulated showing tulip traders as brainless monkeys. Now, stick a pin in those pamphlets. They'll matter later. By 1636, anyway, the market, it was unrecognisable. Tulip dealing was year-round now, and taverns in the major cities looked less like the drinking halls they were and more like stock exchanges with crowds huddled over ledgers. And I saw this in a documentary on Tulip Mania, and they're bursting into laughter and applause when a big deal has landed. And when it did, the buyer paid a small fee called the Winkkoop, or wine money, so everyone could drink to the success. And by 1636, prices had soared to just mad, extraordinary levels, apparently. In Mackay's book from 1841, he has an actual chart showing a now famous list of goods offered in barter for a single bulb of a tulip variety called the Viceroy. And this wouldn't have been a top bulb, but it would have been a good bulb nonetheless. So this is what you get for one Viceroy bulb. 4 tons of wheat, or 4 tons of rye, or 2 tons of butter, or 1,000 pounds of cheese. Now there's more on the list, but they're the ones that stood out. Forgive the quick interruption, but I want to let you know about our subscription service. For just $1.99 a month, you get every weekly episode completely ad-free, so you can enjoy the story without any interruptions. Subscribers also unlock a library of special episodes from when Keith was still co-hosting with me, including a 3-part deep dive on Disney and a 2-parter on Guinness. They're brilliant. Now, Keith isn't part of the show anymore, but I still have a good few hour-long episodes that I recorded with him, and they're going to be released on the 1st of every month over the next few months. Again, for subscribers only. All of that for just $1.99 a month. If you'd like to join, it's really simple. On Spotify, just tap on the little lock symbol next to the bonus episodes in the feed. On Apple Podcasts, click on the show and you'll see the option to subscribe. Or if you prefer Patreon, head to patreon.com/Great Business Stories. There's also a link in the About section at the top of the podcast page to the Patreon page. And of course, if subscribing isn't for you right now, that's grand. Following the show and telling a friend about it is a huge help. Alright, back to the story. And people lived as though they were true millionaires. Like from the wealthy merchants to chimney sweeps, everyone was buying high and selling higher. And chroniclers called them paper millionaires. This was one of the first mentions of paper millionaires. And as New Year's approached, this is the end of 1636, moving into 1637, confidence was sky high. And like every bubble, the people caught up in this, they thought it would last forever. And now we laugh at this foolishness, the idea that the good times will keep going. But most of us have lived through bubbles and been caught up in them. I was in my 20s and started an internet company at the height of the internet bubble. And yeah, I thought it would last. Like, despite the fact that most of these internet companies had negative revenue, were being run by business grads with zero experience, me included, and were pitching half-baked ideas that somehow got $1 million valuations overnight, me included. I pitched a half-baked idea. It wasn't valued at millions overnight though. But on reflection, it was crazy. But when you're in the bubble, you just can't see that. So we're now at the start of 1637. Holland is awash with these, ecstatic paper millionaires, weavers, carpenters, chimney sweeps, convinced their whole lives were behind them. But of course, bubbles have to burst at some stage. And in February of that year, the whole thing was stretched really, really thin. It was just waiting for the smallest spark. And that came in Haarlem, in a tavern, February the 3rd, 1637. Growers and speculators gather for what should have been a routine bulb auction. The auctioneer calls out the first price. Silence. He lowers the price. Still silence. Nothing. And a hush falls. Eyewitnesses said it felt eerie until a voice shouts, "No more." Chaos erupts. Florists turn pale, realising the run is over. Seasoned traders sprint out the door and send warnings to other towns, while one bulb grower apparently collapses into a chair with his head in his hands, realising that his fortune has evaporated. And the panic spread fast. Within days, the news it raced across the country, and buyers vanished. Contracts that were worth thousands one week now found no buyers the next, even at a fraction. A bulb once valued at 5,000 guilders couldn't even fetch 50. The bubble had burst. And remember, most of this tulip trade wasn't bulbs being passed around, it was contracts, paper promises for flowers that were still in the ground. And overnight, those papers had no value. Buyers flat out refused to honour them. For the growers who still held actual bulbs, and for the traders who held contracts worth thousands, it was catastrophic. Like, many had already spent that money counting on the contracts being fulfilled, and now the wealth they thought they had vanished, and trust between friends evaporated. Trader partners turned on each other, and with the prices in ruins, speculators on the other side of the trade, those who owed the money, they faced a choice: pay up and bankrupt themselves, or walk away. And as we said, most walked. So by mid-February, the tulip growers and traders were holding emergency meetings across the Republic, desperate to salvage something. And after hours of angry debates, they settled on a plan or a proposal. Contracts signed before December 1636 would stand. They'd have to be honoured. Any written later, so you're only talking about December 1636 up until the start of February 1637, they could be cancelled if a buyer paid a 10% penalty. But of course, it was only a proposal, and it sounds more like wishful thinking on their part, because, the speculators who owed the money, they weren't involved in this plan or this negotiation. So then it went up to the Court of Holland, the Republic's highest authority, and the court refused to enforce the contracts at all. In effect, they called them gambling debts. Wind handle, trades of the wind, not binding commerce, which meant buyers could legally walk away. People were left destitute, even the very wealthiest. And again, we go back to Charles Mackay describing the aftermath. Substantial merchants were reduced almost to beggary. Many a representative of a noble line saw the fortunes of his house ruined beyond redemption. Mackay went on to say that the Dutch economy was shattered, plunging into a deep and prolonged depression that brought the golden age to a shuddering halt. And yet, despite all this drama, despite this great bubble that supposedly consumed an entire nation, the truth is, the Dutch economy barely flinched. No great merchant houses fell. No banks collapsed. There weren't any protests, no social uprising that really should have happened if everyone and their mother was involved in the tulip craze. In fact, the tulip trade itself carried on. Prices dropped, yeah, but bulbs kept being cultivated, exchanged, more or less as before. Which begs the question, If this mania truly swept up the whole population, and if it collapsed literally overnight, why wasn't the fallout worse? Isn't that the whole reason the tulip bubble loomed so large in history? It was a frenzy, a madness that, consumed a whole nation. Well, it turns out that the story of the tulip mania, the one that I've just told you, and that's been repeated for centuries, isn't really the truth. In 2007, historian Anne Golgar dug into the archives for her book Tulip Mania, Money, Honour and Knowledge in the Dutch Golden Age. And as she joked herself, the title should have been Tulip Mania, More Boring Than You Thought. I love that. So her research shows that the crash was nowhere near as apocalyptic as legend suggests. As she said, there weren't that many people involved and the economic repercussions were pretty minor. So real prices for bulbs were relatively moderate. And her book, which is a thorough and dense academic work, couldn't identify a single person bankrupted by tulip mania. Not one person. Those trading bulbs at the height of the craze, they weren't chimney sweeps or labourers. They were merchants, brewers, craftsmen, traders, people with reputations, with standing, and with some financial security. Most of the people caught up in tulip mania weren't reckless gamblers at all. They were already tulip lovers, collectors, growers. In other words, the boom and bust, it played out in a much smaller circle than the myth suggests. Now, that doesn't mean it was all made up. Some wealthy merchants did pay large amounts for bulbs, but not on the scale that was reported. There were personal disasters. One Amsterdam speculator was forced to liquidate his assets in 1638, but he didn't go bankrupt. Another merchant slipped out of town under the cover of night to escape his creditors. But these were exceptions. For most wealthy merchants who suffered losses, it stung, yeah, but it wasn't ruinous. And for ordinary speculators, the damage was usually no worse than a few small down payments. And when buyers began refusing to pay up, yes, the market did collapse. But what made it a crisis, it wasn't the money loss, it was the betrayal. Because Dutch commerce at that time was built on trust, on promises. And in a culture where commerce and trading was the foundation on which this new thriving society was being built on, a man's word was sacred, it was beyond doubt, and suddenly men were walking away from their commitments. So tulip mania, it exposed a nerve, not just a fear of financial loss, but a fear that trust itself would no longer hold. And while this is a reason why the collapse hit such a nerve, this wasn't the main reason that explains why this mini-crisis was inflated and exaggerated to such a degree. To explain how it became the myth that we now know, we need to go back to those pamphlets I asked you to stick a pin in earlier on in the story. You see, because the Netherlands was being transformed at this time with all this new money, with this great wealth came a great moral anxiety. Historian Simon Schama put it nicely in his book The Embarrassment of Riches, where he says, the prodigious quality of their success went to their heads, but it also made them a bit queasy. And so when the tulip market collapsed, the Calvinists, sensing an opportunity, they pounced. For them, like the idea that people would spend so much money and give so much attention to something as fleeting as a flower, to them it was immoral. And so the collapse of the tulip market, it provided them with a perfect morality tale. Pamphlets and sermons cast it as proof that consumerism would rot the soul. And there's a story of a sermon given in 1637 after the crash where the preacher rails against the tulip sin, branding speculators as gamblers, idolaters, men who bowed before the flower instead of God. One pamphlet claimed that tulip mania was a plague that swept through Holland and was divine punishment for bottomless avarice. And broadsheets had lurid cartoons like devils clutching at tulips, speculators being dragged to hell. So it was a public humiliation campaign, twisting the knife on anyone who had been involved in the tulip business. So we have the extravagance of tulips, which was an affront to the strict morals of the Calvinists. We have the erosion of trust in trade, where a man's word could no longer be relied upon. But even worse, to many others, the whole story of tulip mania, even the exaggerated story of tulip mania, it blurs the social lines. What if a weaver or a chimney sweep could suddenly get rich through speculation instead of hard work? That upended the value system of society. So the stories of chimney sweeps striking it rich, they weren't records of fact. They were anxieties given voice, I suppose. And those fears and anxieties and a belief that wealth itself was ungodly, it lingers even into today, into how the story gets told. Because the truth that tulip mania was small, contained, relatively harmless, that isn't a very remarkable story. Whereas the myth, an entire nation gone mad over a flower, is far more appealing. And of course, people love a good old dose of schadenfreude, watching the rich, or even better, watching ordinary people with notions above their station fall on their faces, getting their comeuppance. And so this myth, for all those reasons, continued, mainly as a result of lazy financial journalists, lazy historians and economists who simply ran with the exaggerated and, oftentimes fabricated stories that had been passed down through the decades and now the centuries. And so what to make of it all? I mean, what I love about the story, even though most of it isn't true, is that it captures the essence of a bubble. People speculating on something they know very little about, thinking that they're in on a good thing, that they're riding a wave that will keep on going. And the thing about bubbles is that when you're inside one, and I know because I was, you almost never see it for what it is. And there are many reasons why this is the case. For example, every price rise feels like proof that the story is real. Your house goes up another 50 grand, your crypto coin doubles, and it feels like validation, not danger. And bubbles don't just run on numbers, they run on stories, or maybe mantras is a better phrase, as in, housing never goes down. Crypto is the future of money. The internet changes everything. And when everyone around you is repeating the same lines, again, it doesn't sound like speculation. It sounds like common sense. Add to that then the social pressures. Your friends are bragging, your neighbours just made a killing, there's news of overnight millionaires, and of course, with the rise of social media and the way people connect now to like-minded individuals online, you're probably cocooned in your own social proof bubble or an echo chamber, and underneath all of this is FOMO, fear of missing out. So, in effect, people rarely realise they're in a bubble, because the very forces that create the bubble, rising prices, strong narratives, group validation, they also cloud our ability to see that we're in a bubble. Now, most of us know all this. We know bubbles are irrational, and we like to think we're smarter than that, and I'm sure some of you are. But we still repeatedly get caught up in bubbles. I got caught up in the internet bubble in my 20s, and over the last 25 years alone, tens of millions of people around the world have been caught up in housing bubbles, crypto bubbles. There was the Chinese stock market bubble 10 years ago. NFTs, remember those? I'm definitely going to do a story on them someday. So financial bubbles are fascinating. And tulip mania, even though most of it may not be true, or maybe because most of it isn't true, it makes for a great story. And with that, it brings me to our listeners' emails. And this one is from Stephen, who writes, "Love the show. How about doing a story on Kerry Packer?" Now that's a cracking story. So Packer was this larger-than-life Australian billionaire, a businessman, a huge gambler, big into sports. And Steve, you're on the ball here, because Packer's been on my list for a while, but he is such a huge character who led such an eventful life with so many great stories that I think I'll have to do a two-parter on him. Thanks so much for the email and the suggestion, Steve. I hope you've enjoyed the episode as much as I have. And remember, if you have any comments, any corrections, or any story that you'd like me to cover, email me at info@gbspod.com. All the best, folks.